Well, we were promised a prime time on a Saturday night, like 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
What they didn't tell me is you're going to follow the Grateful Dead.
Woodstock, the iconic music festival of the 1960s, had people bathing, getting intimate in public, and consuming large quantities of substances. These stories make Woodstock one of the most famous events in history, alongside Jimi Hendrix's iconic performance. Join us as we get into the details of these stories. In the heat of 1969, having large music festivals became a standard event for the younger generation to experience rock and roll and have the best artists playing various instruments. One of these festivals, the Woodstock Music and Arts Fair, was named one of the most famous music festivals in history, with several stories ranging from a large amount of substance use and extreme behaviors seen by those who attended. This iconic music festival had over 400,000 people, the majority of them intoxicated. These attendees stayed at the venue, which was a large farm, for over 3 days, listening to the sweet atmosphere of music. Woodstock was held in a muddy field near the rural town of Bethel, New York. The attendees went through the pain of beating a long period of traffic jams, alongside shortages of essentials, lightning, and heavy rainfall, just to witness one of the strongest lineups of rock, blues, and folk music groups ever assembled on one stage. After the event of Woodstock in 1969, it became an internationally legendary event, its cultural importance, and the impact it had in the music industry. For each attendee, Woodstock was a whole new experience. There was a wide range of responses and memories, with many people describing their own Woodstock experiences. One of the most shocking aspects of this iconic event for many who attended was the fact that while the overall atmosphere at Woodstock was relaxed, they witnessed so many persons dressed either partly bare or completely bare, and were fully comfortable being bare in the midst of about 500,000 people. These persons dressed bare were busy walking around the field, swimming, or even cheering artists while fully undressed. Appearing this way was not an uncommon sight during the festival. During an interview with one of the attendees in 2009, Walter Mills, who was still a teenager when he attended Woodstock, he explained that he saw all of these people running around bare and swimming that way in the muddy water. Feeling odd about the whole sight and all, he had to yell out to his friend to hurry over. When his friend got to him, he exclaimed, telling him that he wasn't going to believe what he saw, that people were walking about bare. This felt extremely strange to Walter at that time, since he was just 19 years old and was still naive. He also mentioned how he looked out of their tent, and there was this couple who just did it right there on the ground in front of them like nothing had happened. This wasn't all, as there were lots of people having intimate time right there in the open. In another instance, a 17-year-old from White Lake also mentioned how he decided to take his parents to the festival site. When they passed the pond where people were, all of a sudden, 2 young men came out of the water bear. Immediately, they caught sight of his father. They suddenly exclaimed and expressed their joy in seeing an old guy, as they referred to his father. To his shock, they walked from the pond where they were swimming and proceeded to hug his father while dripping wet. This was not an isolated incident, as another witness also mentioned how people appearing undressed was practically natural in that environment. While speaking, he mentioned that Woodstock was more like a small city, having people who were bare all at one time. It seemed very natural for attendees. The appearance was just a natural thing in the event, and it felt more like everyone was a part of something or a family bond that held all attendees together and didn't feel any form of shame. According to him, it felt like it was a very sincere emotional bond with the generation at that time. One striking aspect of the event was the fact that the organizers had a projected number of persons they were expecting, considering the number of tickets they had also printed and sold out. The Woodstock Music Festival was the brainchild of 4 men who were looking for an investment opportunity: John Roberts, Joel Rosenman, Artie Kornfeld, and Michael Lang. Lang had organized the successful Miami Music Festival the previous year, while Kornfeld was the youngest vice president at Capitol Records. Roberts and Rosenman were New York entrepreneurs involved in building a Manhattan recording studio. The four men formed Woodstock Ventures and decided to host a music festival, but the unexpected happened. Michael Lang mentioned that the event was intended for no more than 50,000 people, despite already having sold hundreds of thousands of tickets. The first problem happened when the small upstate New York roads could not handle the resulting traffic. At its longest, the traffic jam on Bethel's Highway was stretched for 20 miles. The attendees were faced with a total standstill and had to take a bold step in abandoning their cars and walking to the festival site when everywhere was stuck. When speaking in an interview about what happened at Woodstock on arrival, Bonnie Geffen recalled this moment of how they had to drive in as far as they could and stopped just when the other cars in front of them stopped, and they realized neither of the vehicles could go any further. As for the New York State Police, they were also not as impressed with the whole problem faced with logistics. They had to shut down 2 exits of the New York State to discourage additional vehicles. Due to the heavy traffic jam that was experienced, the time of the event was affected. Initially, the event was scheduled to begin at 3 p.m., with the band Sweetwater starting. However, the group equipment and materials were part of those stuck in the traffic jam. During an interview, Havens recalled how promoter Lang talked to him to arrive earlier. At that time when the festival started, he was the only musician available. Havens had to start with the performances. Although he attempted to end his set several times, he was told to keep playing as there were no other acts ready to perform. For his final tune, he had to improvise and use the word freedom several times. After Woodstock, this became the theme song for the rest of Havens' career. Another striking aspect of the event, as told by attendees, was the fact that most of the food stands were out of food by late Friday night. The food and eating session was an entity named Food for Love, which was more like a last-minute option for those in attendance after Nathan's Hot Dogs and others declined. Food for Love was overwhelmed by demand and began charging people as high as $1 per hot dog when a typical price outside the festival ground was just about 25 cents. After waiting in long lines and hours, some of the festival attendees decided to burn down the stands. The Hog Farm Collective started cooking and distributing various foods. One of the most striking stories centered around the food issue faced at the festival was that of Jim Shelley, who spent all of Saturday night looking for food, only to discover it was completely sold out. On the way back to his blanket, someone gave him some oranges, which is all he and his friend ate the entire weekend. Hendrick Hertzberg, one of the attendees, shared his story and how he struggled with the toilet facilities. According to him, he explained that it took an hour to find one's way through the crowd to the toilet and wait in line. It could also take another hour to get back, during which one's friends might be lost in the darkness and the thick crowd of people. Security was another fascinating aspect of the event. At Woodstock, security was limited since off-duty police officers were banned. It's estimated that there were no more than a dozen police officers to keep an eye on 500,000 people. This was supposed to be provided by off-duty New York City police officers, but only days before the concert, the NYPD deliberately reminded its employees that off-duty employment was prohibited. The only police presence was local forces from surrounding areas. They spent most of their time attempting to keep the access routes as orderly as possible. From the stories told about police arrests at Woodstock, it was a whole different incident, as arrests for substance possession were not experienced within the concert grounds itself. All sorts of substances were openly sold and traded. One of the observers, Jim Phelan, also mentioned that stands were selling these substances, and they had lots of sales to the point of offering 2 joints for the price of 1. And while all of these were going on, the police weren't interfering with it at all. Aside from that, there were numerous substance camps erected where people hung out and shared substances for the entire period of the 3 days. Performers at Woodstock were not left out in sharing their own experiences. One of the band's drummers, Bill Kreutzmann, said during an interview that they were getting electrocuted on stage, to the point where they couldn't even do a sound check because no one could get near the microphones. At that point, CCR had to perform, and it was 2:30 in the morning. John Fogerty mentioned how he saw a bunch of people who looked a lot like him, obviously humans, apart from the fact that they were mostly bare and were asleep. According to him, it looked like one of those pictures of the souls coming up out of hell. Immediately, they started playing right in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, trying to get things going. When he finally got to the mic, he decided to get things a bit up again and asked the audience if they were enjoying some of the music, stating that those of them on the stage were having a great time. Suddenly, out of nowhere, about a quarter-mile out, some guy who was playing around with his lighter then responded to John saying that he shouldn't worry about it and that the audience was totally with him. When sharing his experience, John mentioned how funny it was for him, since he felt like he was standing before 500,000 people, but somehow, it was like for the rest of the big Woodstock concert, he played for just that guy. As for the storms, at least one artist reportedly was not afraid of being electrocuted. Alvin Lee of the band, 10 years after, chose to sing in the rain after allegedly ignoring warnings he could be electrocuted. He even made a striking comment in response that also became a central part of Woodstock. He responded by saying that if he gets electrocuted at Woodstock, the festival will be able to sell a lot of records. Aside from the stories of it raining heavily on that day, it was also mentioned that it didn't just rain water literally, but it also rained daisies. Some persons even emphasized the fact that what happened at Woodstock on those days was more of water pouring from the skies. According to one of the witnesses from Reddit, one thing was certain on that day. There were light showers at first on Saturday afternoon, and everyone started chanting, "No rain, no rain." For some time, not long after that, the sky cleared, and a helicopter flew over the audience and started dropping what looked like several baskets worth of daisies on the crowd. After Woodstock, a series of other music festivals came after it. Among all, Woodstock was seen as a peaceful, decade-defining moment where peace and love were celebrated. Let's find out details of some of the experiences that took place and the peaceful atmosphere. Woodstock has always been described as an environment where hundreds of thousands of people came together to share moments of peace, love, and brotherhood. Accounts of sharing whatever food, drinks, water, clothing, blankets, and affection were recorded. Another memorable part of the Woodstock Festival was the fact that the Vietnam disagreement was still raging on August 1969. Some people have also speculated that the level of peace experienced at Woodstock could have possibly been a way for people to express how much peace they wanted, since the world outside just couldn't provide that much of it at that time. When tickets for the festival first became available, the organizers of Woodstock advertised that anyone who bought a ticket would be contributing to the protest against any form of disagreement. Many of the musicians who performed at Woodstock were against the Vietnam disagreement and spoke out in opposition during their set. One of the strongest protests came when Country Joe McDonald performed an impromptu 8-song set as the second act on the second night of the festival. Although he wasn't scheduled to perform then, the scheduled artist, Santana, was not available at that time. He walked out on stage, yelled out to the crowd, and led a sing-along version of his powerful anti-disagreement anthem. However, it was told that some of the performers and their management began to adopt a different approach towards the concert promoters after sensing how chaotic the event was and were scared of if it might extend itself to payment. The Who and Janis Joplin were among the artists who told the promoters only hours before they were scheduled to play that they would no longer accept checks drawn from the promoter's corporation. They wanted cash instead. The promoters had to resort to one of their banking contacts in the area, a man named Charlie Prince, who worked at the Sullivan County National Bank. At midnight on Saturday, he was woken out of bed. He didn't even get dressed. He was still in his pajamas. He had his bathrobe on, got on a helicopter to his office, and then went to the site with enough money and cashier's checks to keep the performers happy. All of these were done just to maintain the level of peace and calm all through the festival. After Richie Havens performed, Sweetwater finally made it and started playing at approximately 6:15 p.m. Then, a Hindu monk, Swami Satchidananda, was referred to after Woodstock as the Woodstock Guru. At about 10 p.m., an Indian sitarist, Ravi Shankar, took the stage. He brought with him the first of the weekend's thunderstorms, which ended up turning the entire area into a sea of mud. Hendrick Hertzberg, initially excited to have gotten a decent spot in proximity to the stage, described his experience explaining how their sleeping bags and clothes got hopelessly soaked and full of mud. But people didn't care any bit and were still happy and peaceful. Their spot at Woodstock was right next to an aisle, thick, slippery, and full of mud. According to him, as they lay there trying to sleep, a constant stream of people kept moving back and forth. All through the night, people's feet were slammed a few inches from their heads. Most of these passers-by were chemically disoriented from the substance they've had. Their panic and confusion made them unaware of their steps. The rain, the mud, and the unending fear of having one's face stepped made falling asleep difficult. Some attendees, such as one teenager from Huntington, seemed to enjoy the conditions as they were body surfing in the mud. He even mentioned how he was one of the major participants in sliding down the hill in the mud. The sliding got to a point where they would get running and then slide through the mud for what seemed like about 50 feet. There's no doubt that Woodstock remains in the hearts of attendees. Let's take a look at the impact it had on them. Among the artists that were booked to perform for Woodstock 1996, promoters had issues bringing in the iconic Jimi Hendrix to perform at Woodstock. The budget for any single artist was around $15,000, but during this time, Jimi Hendrix was already receiving way above that for festival performances. His fee is rumored to have been around $18,000 to $26,000, making him the highest paid performer at that time. This was more like 3 times what some of the other major acts were paid. Promoters also wanted to put Hendrix on at midnight on Saturday. However, they were told Hendrix would only perform as the last artist, so they had to reluctantly agree. This was supposed to be sometime on Sunday evening, but with the rain, logistical issues, and other unforeseen delays, Hendrix did not appear until 9 a.m. on Monday. By the time Jimi came in, the large crowd of people went as low as 30,000 persons. His performance lasted for 2 hours. This is recorded as the longest single-time performance in his career. During Jimi's performance, one of the most iconic highlights took place, and this was a remarkable Star-Spangled Banner, which was part of a 22-minute medley. Some persons labeled the performance uneven, but it certainly made an impression on those who remained to see it, and to date, it has become one of the iconic highlights of Woodstock. In an interview, Michael Wadley, the Woodstock film director, talked about Hendrix's performance with MSNBC's Michael Ventry. He mentioned how he felt so much pressure and responsibility when he started the Star-Spangled Banner. According to him, from the footage, he looked right over at him more like he was trying to ask him to listen to this part of the performance properly, as he was going to love it the most. That performance came out to be one of the most amazing versions. He had to look out with one eye, and he saw people grabbing their heads, so ecstatic, so stunned and moved. A lot of people holding their breath, including himself. Wadley also worried his camera motor was so overheated, he thought it would stop at any moment. Hendrix's amps were so loud, he couldn't even hear if the camera was still recording. Because Woodstock was not televised and much of the national media had already left the site, it was not until the release of the documentary that Hendrix's rendition of the anthem became a classic. Both praised and damned, it is still critically discussed and widely played today. As for Hendrix, he also gave his perspective on the moment, and he mentioned how he saw it as a beautiful piece. The initial plan for Woodstock called for the event to be held at Howard Mills Industrial Park in Wallkill, New York. Wallkill town officials backed out of the deal, passing a law that eliminated any possibility of holding the concert on there. Woodstock Ventures had to explore a few other venues, but none worked out. Finally, just a month ahead of the concert, 49 years dairy farmer Max Yasgur offered to rent them part of his land in the White Lake area of Bethel, New York, surrounded by the verdant Catskill Mountains. With the concert just a month away, the 4 partners jumped at the opportunity and paid his price. With a venue and talent secured, the partners turned to logistics. Fencing, entrance gates, and ticket booths needed to be set up, and a performer's pavilion, concession stands, bathroom facilities, and medical tents were built. But by the time people started arriving a couple of days ahead of the concert, the fencing, gates, and ticket booths still weren't ready. According to Lang, in an interview, he mentioned how they had to prioritize the people's needs over the logistics and fencing. Aside from that, there was truly no efficient way to charge attendees anymore, so the partners decided to make Woodstock a free event. The land was a natural bowl that led down to a small pond and seemed a perfect setting for what Lang had in mind. The land was leased, and despite some opposition from the officials in Bethel, the concert was on. To date, Woodstock, which took place on Max Yasgur's 600 acres, is recognized as a place where everyone dropped their defenses and became a huge extended family, joined together, getting into the music and each other. Woodstock made people recognize one another for what they were at the core, as brothers and sisters, and made it possible for them to embrace one another in that knowledge. It has been decades after Woodstock took place, more than a long time for the memories to have faded. But to many of the attendees, the festival had a lasting effect on their lives. One attendee from Middletown mentioned how he went to Woodstock confused, naive, without any form of connection to anyone or anything, but he left knowing that he was connected to an entire generation of people who thought like he did. In another instance, a different attendee from Smallwood also mentioned how he was a fairly straight high school athlete, but after the festival, his eyes were open to something that I had been looking for but didn't know what it was until he experienced it. It was a life-changing event for him. Howard Loberfeld described how attending Woodstock made him more willing to trust people because he was raised not to trust people and to be wary of strangers. But at Woodstock, he had there with him about 500,000 of people who were being so nice and happy, just listening to the music and sitting in the mud. It gave him a different perspective on humanity. When Havens passed on in 2013, by his request, his ashes were scattered at the Woodstock site. This was a way of affirming how memorable Woodstock was to those who attended. Although the promoters of Woodstock initially lost millions of dollars, they were fortunate enough to have anticipated a movie about the event would be a lucrative property. It would take a decade, but eventually, the film and music helped to cover up the initial losses. Woodstock, the movie, released in 1970, became a groundbreaking, Academy Award-winning documentary. Even the police were impressed. The chief of the nearby Monticello NYPD stated regardless of the differing personalities, their dress, and their ideas, they were and are the most courteous, considerate, and well-behaved group of kids he has ever been in contact with in his 24 years of police work. Producer John Morris also mentioned that the peace and love mentality was further encouraged by the fact that the festival was virtually free for attendees. Everybody loved it. It got everybody up. Everybody was into it. It was all about sharing with your neighbor and felt like one of the greatest things in the world. Nearly 100% of all eyewitness accounts of the Woodstock experience recall the level of peace enjoyed, love, sharing, and brotherhood. Woodstock's legacy of peace and love was not just a romanticized memory of the music festival. It was true and was experienced by about 500,000 people. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.